Religion, Secularism, and the Japanese Shaping of East Asian Studies by Kiri Paramore. Chapter 9 of the essay Religion and Orientalism in Asian Studies, edited by Kiri Paramore. Criticism of the practice of area studies and the history of Orientalism over the past decades has drawn attention to various problems inherent in Orientalism's historic depiction of non-Western religious tradition. Talal Azad's work in the 1990s problematized modernist constructions of religion in general, demonstrating how, in relation to both the Middle East and Europe, these constructions desocialized and historicized religious traditions and the groups and communities practicing them. In the context of area studies and the history of Orientalism, these kinds of essentialist religion-centered representations of culture have been used to project a vision of often colonized cultures and countries, which is clearly defined to stand against a normative standard of modernity. This is not simply an element in the 19th century history discussed by Said, but has been repeated many times through the late 20th century, and continues to play a key role in politically dominant conceptions of global society. There is no denying the history and current practice of the use of religion to objectify, essentialize, and debase other cultures. Readily discernible in the context of ongoing imperialism, this practice of cultural objectification and negation is also regularly practiced back on the West itself, as work of discourse of so-called Occidentalism has shown. Furthermore, as Assad has demonstrated, this discursive pattern originates from modernist European imaginations of its own history. If to be perceived in terms of colonialism at all, then domestic colonialism might be the concept with which to begin. Certainly, representations of Catholicism in Ireland and other British colonial areas follow this trend. As Peter van der Veer has argued in relation to Britain and India, the emergence of a modern politics of religion and its entanglement with imperialism occurred through the networks of global empire itself. Interaction played a role in determining the ideological contours of imperialism. The imperial center was object as much as subject of this process. This chapter considers one such complex, ongoing process of modern imperial interaction. It examines the role of the academic network of the modern Japanese empire in affecting the history and current practice of area studies on East Asia. I will argue that highly politicized ideologies of secularism lay at the roots of Japanese approaches to different East Asian studies through the 20th century, and that the history of Japanese engagements with these ideologies went on to crucially affect the development of post-Second World War era studies globally. Elite Japanese interventions played a major role in the modern shaping of area studies. Manipulations and adaptations of modern ideas of religion and secularism were centrally developed in largely successful Japanese attempts to control the development of Japanese studies, Chinese studies, and Korean studies through the 20th century. Analysis of these Japanese interventions sheds light both on important aspects in the history of area studies and on current issues in the relationship between religion and the contemporary academic practice of Asian studies and area studies. The maturation of Orientalism into its high period at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, and the transformation of Oriental studies into what we now call area studies in the mid-20th century, both occurred after the consolidation of the modern Japanese state. The modern Japanese nation and its knowledge institutions and elite were thus positioned differently to those of any other object, culture, country of Orientalism and or area studies. Japanese elites had greater capacity to exercise agency over the strategies of representation that gave shape to Japanese studies. Moreover, from the 1890s, Japan also established itself increasingly as an imperial empire, as much in the field of knowledge as economic and military power. Japanese academics and institutions through the early 20th century displaced the French as the dominant force in sinology. They were thereafter able to give shape to development in sinology, as well as Japanese studies, utilizing earlier imperialist and modernist manipulations of the place of religion in Chinese society to ideologically assist their own expensive geopolitical endeavors. The field of Korean studies was basically originated by Japanese scholars in tandem with the creation of other institutions and frameworks of Japanese colonial rule in Korea, and as an offshoot of sinology. Religious paradigms were to the fore in these developments, not only because of the history of their centrality in the European Orientalist tradition, but also because culturalist elements of Marxism based on religious worldviews, notably the Marxist idea of Asian despotism, provided Marxists and leftist educated elites in Japan, a significant element in the academy, a path for conforming to the demands of Japanese expansionist imperialism. The powerful Marxist academic elements in Japan in the early 20th century, although showing anti-imperialist sympathy for the colonized early on, eventually became co-opted into the project of capitalist imperialism partly through these intellectual employments of culture related to religion. This chapter looks first to Japanese influence on the emergence of a field of Japanese studies in Europe, before briefly looking at parallels and disparities between this field of area study and those of sinology and Korean studies, which Japanese scholars critically affected in the 20th century. Finally, the essay will demonstrate the interaction between Japanese constructions of sinology and Japanese self-representation in the emergence of post-Second World War area studies in the United States. It argues that American adoption of the strict religion-based division between Chinese and Japanese cultural history, established by Japanese scholars, and its value judgments, positive for Japan, negative for China, lay at the heart of a post-Second World War reformulation of area studies in the United States. US area studies was thus critically influenced by, in fact was to some extent a repetition of, wartime Japanese sinology, and also demonstrated continually with European traditions of Japanese studies from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which had also been crucially influenced by state-supported Japanese academia. This chapter is thus divided chronologically into 4 parts. Part 1 looks at Japanese roles in the constructions of a vision of Japanese culture in Europe, notably in London, Berlin, and Hamburg. Part 2 looks at Japanese sinology and Korean studies pre-1945. Part 3 looks at the effects these pre-1945 Japanese-shaped images of East Asia had on the crystallization of US approaches to the area studies in the early Cold War. The chapter concludes in Part 4 by considering the central role of religion in all these developments and thinking about how current trends in the engagement of religion with Asian studies and area studies relate to this formational history of the discipline. Religious and literary scholarship in Japan at this time represented the dominant secularist ideology of the times and participated in state attempts to portray Japanese culture, notably including the Shintō tradition, in secularist terms. This was achieved in large part through an emphasis of the native, meaning non-Sino-Japanese, Japanese literary tradition, a literary tradition that Florence also engaged. Florence's ethnological and religious methodology, however, inherited from sinology, went against these dominant Japanese-led secularist and national exclusivist trends. Japanese scholars did all they could to clearly disengage Japanese studies from sinology and the history of Japanese religion and culture from that of China. There were clear geopolitical imperatives behind this. Japanese were already, by the mid-19th century, well before the Meiji Restoration, very aware of the problems faced by China in relation to Western power. The enforcement of unequal treaties on Japan in the late 19th century used the same justifying discourse of civilizational development as that used on China. Large-scale dispatch of Japanese students to Europe in the late 19th century, primarily through Japanese state support, equipped the Japanese elite with real-time sensitivity to changes in the European civilizational discourse with justified imperialism. They were therefore in a good position to detect the rising role of political secularism in these discourses and its interaction with increasing acceptance of the idea of separation of church and state, separation of religion and state, in the ongoing construction of Western ideas for political modernity and civilization. Later, this close engagement would also allow Japanese intellectuals to quickly engage and explore social organism theory and other pre-runners of racialism. Japanese elites in both the new state-sponsored and controlled modern university system and the state itself were therefore from the very beginning careful to project an image of Japan as secular, even to the extent of disengaging traditions like Shintō into secularized state Shintō and religious shrine Shintō sections. Japanese intellectuals were also very successful in projecting this new image of Japan as an advanced secularist state back into Europe. Degruschi has alluded to the extent of Japanese manipulation of late 19th to early 20th century European academia in this book, Orienting Arthur Whalley, where he shows a significant intersection between Japanese political, cultural, and intellectual interests as the emergence of serious scholarship of Japan in England and elsewhere in Europe. Japanese state and state-aligned Buddhist sect-supported students in Europe also played a major role in this process of influence. One major example of this kind of influence was at the German institution, which in my view is key to understanding early Japanese studies, the Seminar für Orientalische Sprachen in Berlin. The Seminar für Orientalische Sprachen in Berlin. In the final decades of the 18th, well before Florence Chair was established at Hamburg in 1914, and during one of the many periods of inactivity of Japanology at Leiden and Paris, the German government established the SOS in Berlin. This institution is considered formative in the careers of many later leaders in Japanese studies, including Florence himself, and perhaps, more importantly, Serge Elisseff, who trained there before going to Tokyo. This institute emphasized language training, but also included elements of Landeskunde, a form of what we might now call content area studies. The first ever teacher of this subject in Berlin was a Japanese state-supporting student, Inoue Tetsujiro. While studying philosophy in Berlin on a Japanese government grant, Inoue had already been teaching at the University of Tokyo and would go back to be appointed the first Japanese professor of philosophy at that university in 1890. One of his major roles at the University of Tokyo was the founding of the academic study of Confucianism in Japan, a study he would present not in terms of religion, but as philosophy. Inoue is also generally recognized as one of the major nationalist ideologues of Japan in this period, specializing in the defense of the state's secularism through radicalizing attacks on other religions, as well as through academic projects, which in effect secularized and sanitized the elements in Japanese history, culture, and though that may have otherwise been perceived in religious terms. The fact that the program of area studies knowledge on Japan attached to this formative institute in Berlin was devised by a Japanese of this caliber is notable. No other non-Western country's official state academic elite was able to so crucially affect the Western academic study of their country. The SOS went on over the following decades to train many of the most influential Western scholars working on China and or Japan, crucially including Serge Elisseff, the founder of East Asian Studies at Harvard in the 1930s, and, as will be discussed later, in many ways the grandfather of modern area studies. Japan's ability to influence such central institutions of Western Japanese studies so early was facilitated as much by the quick knowledge-based westernization of Japan. Chapter 1: Japan in Europe and Europe's Japan. Japanese studies was the last of the traditional fields of Oriental studies to emerge in Europe. European Oriental studies tended to originate from biblical studies, those starting with the Abrahamic cradles of the Middle East, and moving slowly further away to the east in the geography of their areas of interest. The 19th century professionalization of Oriental studies also demonstrated the trend of eastward geographic development. Sinology thus came after studies of areas to the west of China, and Japanese studies only emerged on the periphery of and chronologically after Sinology. The first professional scholars of Japan in Europe clearly emerged from Sinology. The first professorial chair in Japanese studies, established at Leiden in 1855, was actually conceived of as a chair of education in both Chinese and Japanese. It is clear from the publications of that first professor, Johann Joseph Hoffmann, that he perceived of and positioned his work as part of a European academic field of Sinology. Later foundational figures in European Japanology, notably the first professor of Japanology at the German University, Karl Florenz, and even mid-20th century figures like Serge Elisseff had also been trained originally in Sinology. These early scholars of Japan who emerged from Sinology always positioned religion centrally. Hoffmann did that by using Confucianism centrally in education on Japan, developing the first of the 4 books of Neo-Confucianism, the Dasue, or Great Learning, as his main primer for Japanese. He explained the choice in the following terms. The grand study, Daihyo, or as it is called in Japan, Daigaku, is the first of the 4 classical books of the Chinese, and not alone in the Middle Kingdom, but also among all the Oriental peoples, who are indebted for their civilization to the influence of the Chinese literature as the basis of their moral and political education. This led Hoffmann on to the conclusion that appending a standard Japanese version of the text provides us an opportunity of furnishing an example of the scientific style of the Japanese. For Hoffmann, the prime religious text of East Asia, in its Japanese context, was an example of the most scientific form of the Japanese language. A prime text of intellectual tradition was core to language learning, and specifically scientific language learning. The contemporaneous stereotyping of Confucianism as a pre-modern throwback indicative of a stagnant society is nowhere to be seen. Karl Florenz privileged religious ethnographical approaches in his representation of core elements of a recently created modern Japanese national canon of traditional Japanese literature. As Michael Wachutka has pointed out, this approach of Florenz, although typical of European Orientalists of the time, ran against the political imperatives of the Japanese scholars Florenz had studied in Tokyo. As by Japanology's relative state of underdevelopment in the Oriental studies fields of 19th century Europe. Korean studies was begun in earnest under the auspices of a westernized university system of post-Meiji Japan. Japanese imperial designs on Korea, which were realized by increasing control of the peninsula around the turn of the century and formal annexation in 1910, created a special place for Japanese scholars in originating Korean studies, not only as a major part of the disciplines of Oriental studies, Tōyogaku, and Oriental history, Tōyoshi, in Japanese universities, but also through the establishment of Keijo, Seoul, Imperial University, as an academic outpost of the Japanese elite in Korea. The shared Confucian and Buddhist religious traditions of both countries and the medium of classical Chinese further empowered the Japanese countries, and the medium of further empowered Japanese intellectuals to steer a course for representations of Korea in the westernized world of international academia. It was in this context that Korea, and notably the Joseon dynasty, which Japanese power displaced, was often historicized in the classical Orientalist term of Sinitic stagnation, a stagnation attributed primarily to the central role of religion in Korean, as in Chinese, society. This approach both fit European intellectual trends of the time and acted as a perfect justification for Japanese imperialism in Korea. Japanese control in Korea was thus justified academically in similar terms as Western powers had justified intervention in China. The interluders represented the force of enlightenment in a backward stifled sacralized polity, the unchanging timeless world bound by timeless religious relations which will live on into the later 20th century in the form of Marxist ideas on Asian despotism or Weber's vision of China. In the case of China, Japanese scholars did not need to originate a new discourse, but merely appropriate what had been articulated so clearly in Europe from Hegel's description of Chinese empire as theocratic despotism onwards. According to the likes of Hegel, Ranke, and other baselines in 19th century Western intellectual life, Confucianism, religious and timeless domination of Chinese society had created a despotic society, requiring some form of liberation. Already from the 1890s, Japanese scholars had begun to ruminate upon what kinds of liberation might be possible. Some argued that China could not go on as one country. Breakup into smaller regional units was inevitable. Others saw absorption of China into a Japanese-led East Asian Federation as the only option. Still, others argued that China could only be ruled by an absolutist autocratic regime. Japan and other nations must simply choose and support someone appropriately receptive to their own interests. Yuan Shikai was pushed forward on many occasions in these terms. Naito Konan, the major sinologist of the 20th century, is an example of a Japanese scholar who is both partly representative of the imperialist imperatives of sinology at this time, and yet who also, to some extent, tried to resist those imperatives. Most famously, he defended the viability of a unified, culturally coherent Republic of China in his 1914 book Shinarong, discussing China. His thesis defending the idea of a republic against its mainly Japanese detractors rested squarely on an inversion of the by this time usual reading of a relation between Neo-Confucianism and Chinese politics as a purely negative cause of stagnation. Naito's contrary claim, and the theory still actively discussed by sinologists and global historians today, was that China, far from being behind the ball on modernization, had actually already reached a kind of earlier modernity in the Song dynasty. His articulation of this, what came to be called Song modernization thesis, was multifaceted. The Song was modern in terms of its literacy, its commercial culture, the state's relation to the market, and in various other facets. The core of Song modernity, however, was religious intellectual. Neo-Confucianism's emphasis on individual moral subjectivity and its interaction with family and then state governance. This linkage of Neo-Confucianism to a modern moral publicness will be picked up half a century later by American and Chinese scholars claiming for Neo-Confucian religiosity a special suitability with liberalism. In his own time, by positing a positive role for the indigenous religious and cultural traditions of China in a vision of modernity, Naito provided a theoretical alternative to Japanese imperialist brute domination. However, Naito's criticism of Chinese traditions of bureaucracy have also been likened to those of Max Weber, and similarly can be seen as having justified a culturalist prejudice against China employed in imperialism. In this way, we can see in the Japanese tradition of sinology a similar tension to that identified by Suzanne Marchand in the modern academic manifestation of Oriental studies in 19th century Europe. Marchand implies a tension in the tradition between a secular, practical imperialist drive for knowledge and pejorative representations of Asia on one hand, and a religiously inspired and positively universalist desire to find the form of original Christian truth within non-biblical societies on the other. In Japan, not only the imperatives of modern empire, but also the values of the tradition circles of Chinese learning, Kangaku, and Confucianism for the early modern period, the Tokugawa shogunate, were visible in the origins of modern Orientalism, To-Yogaku, within which China and Korea were studied. This traditional Confucianism's effect on the modern discipline, like Christianity's effect on modern Orientalism in Europe, explains the incredible sympathy for China, especially in its Song Neo-Confucian form, as expressed by Naito. A good parallel example from Korean studies is Takahashi Toru. Takahashi authored the first modern academic publications on the history of Korean Buddhism and Confucianism. While his approach to Buddhism emphasized its stagnancy and lack of cultural development in relation to China, his work on Korean Confucianism could not help but follow the early modern Japanese tradition praising the Korean Neo-Confucianism of Ii Toegye. In this way, Takahashi both played into the discourse of stagnancy for Korea in relation to Buddhism and for China in relation to Confucianism, and also provided a lifeline to Korean cultural history, and thereby potentially national identity and pride, by asserting the existence of an indigenous progressive culture defined through Ii Toegye's Confucian religiosity. Takahashi's historically correct linkage of this Korean tradition to Japanese Confucianism furthermore provided a basis for conceiving of Korea within the Japanese Empire in a comparatively positive way. This discourse encouraged a pluralist vision of culture within the empire and inherently opposed the assimilationist discourse of Japanese cultural superiority that was on the rise in Japan during that time. Takahashi, Naito, and their peers, operating in an increasingly totalitarian and anti-Chinese early 20th century Japan, had little room to move. They possessed within themselves a tension around the issue of the representation of religion, and they were clearly aware of and deliberately engaging the politics of the representations. Yet, ultimately, their work at the time was primarily employed in the process of ongoing imperialism. A similar internal conflict and ultimate result can be seen in the history of the scholars who later undertook on the ground religious ethnography work in northeastern China during the Japanese occupation of the 1930s. Despite the fact that Naito's thesis was obviously ineffective in halting anti-Chinese sentiment in early 20th century Japan, it is still highly significant as an example of the way inverting the place of religion in an Orientalist discourse can work to problematize a generally imperialist outlook. By inverting the place of the dominant religious tradition in imperial Chinese history, Neo-Confucianism, Naito countered theological developmentalist arguments which sought to justify a modernizing violent intervention in China. Takahashi, by doing something similar in the Korean case, was not advocating Japanese withdrawal from Korea, but he was implying the Korean national identity within the Empire of Japan had value. Takahashi's position was thus inherently supportive of a vision of imperial plurality and resistant to proposed imperial policies of violent cultural assimilation. Both scholars constructed their competing narratives by historicizing and by digging deeper into the complex sociology of religion in China and Korea. Revising the imperialist employment of Orientalism in geopolitics was intimately related to recasting the value attributed to religious culture that underlay that Orientalist perspective. Orientalism, and particularly the role of religion therein, was not necessarily imperialist. In fact, quite the opposite. As the example of Naito shows, the religious element was central to early attempts by area specialists to resist imperialist manipulations of the representation of particular civilizations or cultures. This then brings us to the relationship between Orientalism and area studies. Some see the emergence of area studies in post-Second World War America as representing a break with the tradition of Oriental studies. They depict area studies as having emerged more from wartime intelligence structures than from pre-war academic ones. Yet, if we look at the roots of area studies in wartime and immediately post-Second World War America, notably in Harvard's East Asian Studies program, where most writers see this beginning, the continuity between classic European Orientalism and post-war American area studies is personified by Serge Elisseff. Elisseff began his studies of China and Japan in Berlin at the SOS. Although Inoue had long left by this stage, he came into contact there with Japanese of similar academic standing and right-wing political proclivities, notably Shinmura Izuru. From Berlin, Elisseff made his way to Japan, where he was the first Westerner to gain normal entry to a degree program at the University of Tokyo, and the first to gain a standard degree by coursework and thesis. At Tokyo, he studied Japanese literature. Although his thesis was written on Matsuo Basho, most of his coursework and a large section of his final examinations were based around national learning, kokugaku, commentary on works of Japanese literature, what today will be studied as intellectual history of the history of religion. He also continued his interest in Chinese and began learning Korean. On return to Europe, he talked about both China and Japan, but was academically active primarily in sinological circles and associations. His appointment at Harvard as the first professor of Far Eastern languages was very much because of his capacity across the different area fields. His experience in Japan and his reputation in the French world of sinology. Professor Elisseff started on his dual task of building up a center of Far Eastern studies at Harvard in the past traditions of European sinology and of seeking to influence through it sinological studies at the Christian universities of China. It was under his professorship that the transformations associated with the beginnings of area studies in the United States occurred. He was professor to the figures notably associated with early area studies, notably Edwin Reishawa and John Whitney Hall. They were exposed to an education based on the traditions of European Orientalism, almost always centered on issues of religion, intellectual history, or literature related to great religious traditions, notably Confucianism and Buddhism. In fact, well into the 1950s, the Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies was dominated by articles on these topics, often authored by scholars who, ironically, at the same time, were profiling themselves as advocates of a more social scientific approach to area studies. This attention at Harvard to the academic standard of European Orientalism did not end with Elisef. His student and replacement, Reischauer, also continued to supervise traditional cultural subjects. Reischauer was even more representative than Elisef on the deep interaction between Chinese and Japanese studies in the birth of area studies. Recent studies often compare Reischauer and Feuerbach, seeing the former as the father of modern Japanese studies and the latter of Chinese studies. In the 1950s, however, the division between the two was primarily based on period, not country. As Elisef has done before him, Reischauer thought the pre-modern periods, with all the classic literary and religious tradition, for both Japan and China. Feuerbach, meanwhile, did the modern period, again for both countries. Reischauer's first Chinese connection, then, was related to his pedagogical tasks. Much more importantly, however, Reischauer also packaged the entire Harvard enterprise of expanding Asian studies, the birth of area studies, including the privileging of literary and intellectual rather than only social scientific studies, in relation to US national imperatives in the immediately post-Second World War Chinese Civil War. The peoples of Asia are asking for an ideology. We have in many ways failed to give it to them. There is a crying need for people to have our ideology. We aren't in the habit of giving it. We have the ideology, but we aren't presenting it to other people. The real point I want to bring up is the problem of the special place of the scholarly classes in the Far East, particularly in the area of China, Korea, and Japan, that area affected by Chinese civilization. If we explore the special prestige position of the scholar, the intellectual group in that area, it will seem to me that propaganda work, information aimed primarily at them, would be the most effective kind of information work. Previous commentators, notably Dower, have focused on the implications of this quote relating to the politicization of the scholarly creation of area studies. What I find interesting, however, is rather the emphasis of intellectual knowledge for real purposes. Reischauer followed Orientalist tradition as much as reality in seeing Chinese intellectuals and intellectual discourse as being deeply tied to a vision of culture that was rooted in intellectual, literary, and religious tradition. The reason why modern US national interest area studies had to center on these kinds of religious and intellectual questions was related to the centrality of religion in Asia culture life, imagined by the Orientalist tradition in which Reishawa had been trained. Indeed, it is exactly this respect for local tradition and the multifaceted nature of cultural experience that makes Reishawa a so much more sympathetic character than the American area studies advocates who came after him. Reishawa's excellent knowledge of and sensitivity towards Japan came partly from growing up there as the son of a missionary. For him, East Asian culture was the environment he had grown up within. Those who followed Reishawa had rather discovered East Asian culture as an object of military intelligence training. Despite themselves having been trained as linguists and humanists, these later figures showed little comparative respect for either language or culture, notably including religion, in their visions of area studies. Their deification of the social sciences, which at the time usually implied a quantitative method, at the expense of other academic approaches, allowed area studies to become a field much less sympathetic of the people under study. Hull's argument at the time for discipline-based, quantitatively testable theories was clearly couched as a response to the power of communist class analysis. Yet, for a reader today, Hull's naive determinism strikes one as ironically Marxist, although obviously much more primitive than any Marxist analysis one will come across today. The attempt to jettison culture from the base of area studies also ironically went hand in hand with a much more nation-state based approach. Whereas all specialists in Japan up to and including Reishawa had in-depth knowledge of China and Chinese, later US-based Japanese studies scholars had often only basic, if any, Chinese language training, and bought into Reishawa's Cold War ideologically conceit of seeing Japan and China as opposite cultures. This conceit, in turn, was of course learned from earlier Japanese nationalist conceptions associated with figures like Inoue. Ironically, post-Second World War US scholarship on Japan thus accepted major tropes of modern Japanese pre-1945 nationalist imaginings of the cultural divisions between Japan and China. These were divisions which, as we saw earlier, rested on a fake portrayal of Japan in secularist terms, contrasted against a deeply cultured originally European vision of imperial China as dominated by a kind of undifferentiated pre-Protestant religiosity that ensured China, like India, Africa, etc., remained as backward as the pre-Enlightenment, pre-Reformation Europe imagined by Protestant bigots of the earlier 2 centuries. It was the religion vision of China and Japan, the separation between the two along the secularist, modernist lines of modern national imperialism, which lay at the basis of the transformation from Orientalism to area studies, both in continuity and in change. Religion is thus a centrally important plank in the politics of area studies, partly because it was so already in Oriental studies, but more pertinently and less visibly because the modern nationalist ideology of secularism gives religion and or the denial of it particular ideological power in political modernity. Especially in secularist imaginations of modernity, religion is central to the condemnation of a place as not modern. We can see this historically in fin de siècle French approaches to China, early 20th century Japanese approaches to Korea, and late 20th century US approaches to Southeast Asia. But we can also see it today in some US and European approaches to the Middle East, and in some Chinese depictions of Xinjiang and Tibet. The history of Japan's engagement with Orientalism and area studies, in the depiction of Japan itself, and in its role depicting China and Korea, tells us that without serious historically conscious consideration of religion, area studies remains all too open to political manipulation and abuse. Because religion has been such a central element in the cultural essentialisms constructed to justify imperialism, it is vital that it be studied centrally in critical area studies. This is particularly the case in light of the current trend of using secularism in its place. Repeating 1950s visions of a social science-based area studies, which through quantitative scholarship provides an objective vision of Asia, is naive, not only in its denial of the role of exactly this kind of scholarship in late 20th century international violence and imperialism, e.g. Vietnam, but also in its assumption that an uncritical acceptance of the ideology of secularism is an escape from the discourse of religion. Secularist academic and political ideologies are simply one more form in the ongoing deployment of religious discourse as the core of area studies. Rather than a solution to the religion problem, they are a reminder of how central religion is to any attempt to historically or sociologically understand an area culture.